Hi, I'm Tanya Tomaszewska. Welcome to my TT Wine Explorer podcast. This podcast is about my adventures in the deep and wide world of wine. It's about discussions which I have along the way through my lens as an everyday wine enthusiast turned cork dork and reform banking lawyer turned wine industry professional. Today, we're going to stay in British Columbia, my home province in Canada, and fly to the Okanagan Valley. For those not familiar with it, the Okanagan Valley is British Columbia's largest wine-producing region, both geographically and in terms of the volume of wine produced here. There is the huge sea-like Okanagan Lake, which runs more than 100 kilometers long up and down the valley, and it's the geographic centerpiece of this region. It's one of the reasons why we can make wine in these northern reaches of the globe. The Okanagan region runs from the 49th parallel in the town of Osoyoos, just on the border with Washington State and located in Canada's one true desert, all the way up to the 50th parallel in Lake Country, north of Kelowna, which is decidedly cooler climate. And it's in this more northern and central part of the Okanagan Valley where we'll land today to have a discussion with Grant Stanley, the winemaker of SpearHead Winery. Grant is a very highly regarded and award-winning winemaker. SpearHead opened in 2010 and is a small family winery located in bucolic, rolling hills and farmland area, about a 10 or 15-minute drive from the center of Kelowna. Both Grant and SpearHead are pretty much all about and known for their Pinot Noir. I read somewhere once that Grant says that he thinks about Pinot Noir about 80% of the time. Well, I know from all of my fantastic tasting experiences at SpearHead that Grant thinks about Pinot Noir a lot, but in my view, Grant thinks about a lot of other things. He's a wealth of knowledge about his craft, SpearHead's mission, our region, our wine industry, and generally all things wine. I always enjoy my chats with Grant Stanley. I hope that you enjoy our discussion today. Let's fly. Hi, Grant. Thanks so much for joining as my guest today.
Hi. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be with you.
Based on our previous discussions and tastings with you at SpearHead, I know that we could talk literally for hours about a broad range of topics relating to the wine world. But for this episode, I'd like to discuss the kinds of wines which you're making at SpearHead and your laser focus and mission around grape variety selection, clones, and vineyards. But I'd also like to discuss the broader context in which you're applying your craft and the current landscape for grape growers and winemakers here in BC, particularly in light of the real challenges which our wine industry is facing here. But before we dive into that, let's start with a bit of background. You've been making wine for a while now, both here in BC and beyond. Can you tell us a bit about your story? How did this all start for you? How and where did you learn to make wine?
Well, it goes back to travels and joy experiences that I was seeking in New Zealand in the early 90s, I guess about 1991, 92. I embarked on a trip to New Zealand. My family are all from New Zealand. My parents are New Zealanders, and I have lots of family there. And so I had, a kind of desire to kind of go there. At that time, I really, I'd been a waiter and a silver service waiter and used that as a form of income for traveling for many years. And so I had a great interest in wine, but I certainly didn't anticipate getting into the wine industry. I guess it was a purely matter of luck. I had a cousin there who was involved in marine farming, and I was working with him in the Marlborough Sounds, very, very close to Blenheim and, obviously the Sauvignon Blanc wine scene in New Zealand. And at that time, there just happened to be a bit of a red tide they basically said we could no longer harvest mussels. And so me and my colleagues were all put out of work. And several of them, went along with myself to Montana. At the time, it was called Montana Wines of Blenheim. The largest winery in the country. And so we went there and applied for work, and they were looking for, just general tank diggers and, laborers effectively. And so that was really my first start. After working with Montana for a little while, I guess about 6 months or so, I certainly developed a keen interest and became one of their cellar hands. There was many of us. There was about 20 cellar hands. And fortunately, they were, happy enough with me, and I was happy enough with them that they were able to sponsor me to, basically have a wine education at the local school for winemakers, which was Nelson Marlborough Polytech accredited by Lincoln University. So at that point, I was able to work nights in the winery and study by day. And I did that for about 2.5 years until I had a degree, and decided at that point that I wanted to move to the North Island and look at maybe working with some smaller wineries. So I did that. I found work as an intern or an apprentice, if you like, at a couple of small wineries in New Zealand before I ended up at, what is a bit of an icon winery over the years for Pinot Noir in particular, a winery called Atarangi Vineyards. And Atarangi, I didn't know it at the time, but Atarangi was already quite famous in the Pinot Noir world because they had captured the Bouchard Finlayson Trophy at the World Wine and Spirits Award on 2 occasions, back to back, and that had never been done before by any winery. And so they were kind of well known in the industry as being, maybe pioneers of Pinot Noir in New Zealand. And as I say, I was super fortunate that they gave me an opportunity to work with them. It was a family business, a family-run business, very small, very, very much like SpearHead now that I look at it. And I was able to intern and apprentice and learn from a man who I think is one of the great winemakers that New Zealand has ever produced, Clive Patton. And Clive and I worked side by side for 8 years at Atarangi, and again, super generous and fortunate that he at some point after about 5 years decided that he wanted to broaden my horizons. And we got into a kind of a pattern of him sending me to a Northern Hemisphere winery every off season to learn from winemakers that he viewed as being influential and had different techniques and things to kind of get my teeth into at the time. So I was at that point going to Oregon, going to California, Burgundy, and every year I would do something different and bring something back to Atarangi as well after those trips.
And now you're at SpearHead, and you've been at SpearHead, I think, for maybe 6 to 7 years. And as I understand it, when you came on board and joined SpearHead, it was really part of that was to really hone in on SpearHead's mission to focus its portfolio to become known as a Pinot house or Pinot Noir specialist. Mission accomplished. You've been kicking some real goals with and at SpearHead. You guys are racking up medals. Wine Align is ranked SpearHead as one of Canada's best performing small wineries. So huge kudos to you. We'll get to winemaking expertise a little bit later, but, a lot of different components go into making an award-winning wine. So maybe let's start with location and from altitude. For those not familiar with the SpearHead Winery site or Kelowna or Central Okanagan generally, from your point of view, you've been and worked in, as we discussed, the iconic Pinot Noir regions in the world. What is it about this region that you think can make Pinot Noir have success, or what is enticing about this area that you think can make it work?
Well, it has one of the key elements for any great Pinot Noir region, and that is having enough heat units to actually ripen the grapes, having good soil, good free draining soil profiles, so that there is the vigor of the vine is reduced. Low rainfall is absolutely critical, and that is certainly one of the great attributes. It doesn't mean that we don't irrigate, in order to, but it gives us the choice as to how big we want the berries and how much water we're going to apply. So all of those elements are here, and then one of the most important ones I think is the around harvest time and just towards the end of the season. Because we're on the 50th parallel here. The autumn really does bring, dramatic temperature shifts and diurnals where we end up with, 20-degree days and, less than 10-degree nights. And this has the effect of really kind of concentrating flavor and acidity, maintaining, reasonable pH in the grapes. And yet you have this, wonderful ripeness underneath all that. So That really is, when I saw that and I see the beautiful fruit, it has a tendency to maintain the quality of the fruit when you have those wonderful cold temperatures and day-night, temperature shifts. Year after year after year, I just couldn't believe the quality of the grape harvest here. And it was, certainly it seemed to me like a 10 out of 10 proposition for many years, because I really never came across, bad disease vintages or, wet vintages like we've seen in Oregon, where, huge rain comes through and damages crop and makes it the whole thing, really a little sketchy. Here, just, perfect weather and perfect conditions across the board. So no, I thought I'd landed in viticultural nirvana when I arrived here, for sure.
So speaking about other Pinot Nirvanas, I'm often asked by wine travelers and customers and clients how British Columbia Pinot Noir compares to Pinot Noir from, for example, from Burgundy, Oregon, New Zealand. My guess is that you get asked that question quite a bit as well. How do you tend to answer that, or do you?
Well, I ask myself that question a lot because, when I first arrived here, of course, I've always considered myself a Pinot Noir pioneer journeyman, if you like, that everywhere I go, I like to take, wines from wherever I'm working and, share them with others. And one of the cool thing about Pinot Noir is that we have a small group of winemakers. It's still not a huge varietal. It accounts for a really, really small amount of total production in the world. And the winemakers are very kind of sharing of information and, always looking to improve the breed. When I take wines from this place into tastings, for example, in Oregon or California, at wine events that are specific for winemakers, I always see something different than what I see drinking them here. So that's probably the best opportunity to really see what you're producing and what it looks like when you see it in a lineup of 8 other wines. And in particular, when you're in California and Oregon, I often feel that the wine isn't quite as ripe as the wines of California and Oregon, which is, there's brightness, there's acidity, everything, but they tend to have, very, very ripe fruit, super ripe fruit. And that shows through in the finished wines as, they have a lot of weight and heaviness. And the wines that I always bring to those events always end up looking super, super elegant in that context. And so, they have that. There's an element of ripeness or a greenery, just ever so slight element that I think ages beautifully and really shows the terroir. So yeah, that's how I kind of view them. I view them as a little lighter, a little less fat and rich than the American version of Pinot Noir. And more, I would say, more closer to Burgundy expressions, where there's there's some ethereal elements and there's some layers and some when you have over ripeness and huge ripeness, it kind of buries the other elements in the wine. And so I really like the fact that these wines kind of dance. They're pretty, as well as being genuinely mouth-filling Pinots.
Well, I have to say, I really love dancing with your Pinot. So thank you. You touched on a few things there, terroir and the etherealness of Pinot Noir, which leads into one of my next questions. And a little bit of an anecdote leading into it, maybe just to humor myself. I have a really vivid memory of a tasting experience, which I had in Willamette Valley a number of years ago. I was living in Australia at the time, doing a lot of wine tasting there. I came over back to BC for a visit. Went down to the Willamette. I went into a tasting room and I asked what they were pouring that day. And they looked at me like I was nuts, like I should have known that answer. This was early days in my Pinot Noir or my wine kind of learning and journey. And I looked at the tasting list and they had, 7 to 9 different Pinot Noirs, red still Pinot Noirs made from that winery. No white, no rosé, all reds. But there were different vineyards. And then it was then that I really started to understand or feel or experience that ethereal, the layers, and the real complexity and the nuances between different vineyards. And so when I moved back to BC from Australia and I started my own journey here in BC wine, I remember coming to SpearHead, and maybe it wasn't 7 or 8 Pinot Noirs in the sitting I had, but certainly maybe 4 or 5, I think, from my recollection. And so this takes me to another, the next building block in winemaking, which is, we've talked about the grape, but now we're talking about the vineyard. So can you share a little bit about your approach on the winemaking program until you're in terms of how you're showcasing different vineyards? And it sounds to me that you think Pinot Noir really is a great vehicle for expressing terroir, the sense of place, judging on your comments about taking your wine around the world.
Yeah, well, I certainly do. And you know what? I think in the early days of Pinot Noir, both in Oregon and in New Zealand, when we were just kind of coming to terms with it, we were all just blending everything and putting everything into a single tank, and it was just Pinot Noir. But you kind of quietly begin to grow that, and as we developed new vineyards in New Zealand, particularly, I was developing new vineyards all the time, and in that you had an opportunity, obviously, to craft the wine. And see that vineyard. And so, it was really, I think the whole single vineyard thing really came from us winemakers looking at the differences of various vineyard sites and various clonal expressions, and seeing all those for ourselves and saying, well, why would I blend this away? This is something that should stand out on its own. And
there's farming and terroir, and there's art and there's science. Winemaking, we could do a 9-hour episode probably just on your winemaking techniques. I won't do that today. I've been through your winery. I know that you have stainless steel tanks. I know you have French oak barrels of different sizes. You employ malolactic fermentation, lee stirring, different types of techniques for blending. And you also make a beautiful Riesling and Pinot Gris. Obviously, winemaking, I expect various aspects are very, very stressful, and we'll get to the Mother Nature component and not to have that necessarily apart. But what are some critical times from your perspective in the winemaking process?
Yeah, I mean, without going through the entire processes in the vineyard, skin exposure, leaf plucking, devigoring, bunch sizes, you could kind of forget about all that. And I would say it really, from the winemaking perspective, it does completely start from the picking decision. So, factor number one, the picking decision, is based on so many things, the weather, the flavor, how many days since flowering, Brix levels, high Brix, low Brix, obviously, high sugars turn into higher alcohol. But most importantly, just general ripeness. I know for a fact that, when I look around the valley, that I on average, I'm picking sometimes 2 to 3 weeks after many, many of my colleagues. And that's just a stylistic choice. I really love what a little bit of raisening can do to a Pinot Noir, where you have maybe 5 or 10% raisening on the bunch. I think those little moments give you, I think the advantage of having, really, really flavorful wines, really dense wines, really ripe wines. So number one is picking. My favorite part of winemaking, and I was asked this the other day, what do I love most about making wine? I love the magic of fermentation. And it is, without a doubt, the time to shine for a winemaker, because every decision you make, every day, there's a transformation going on in front of you, from juice to alcohol, and tracking it, and good husbandry and caring for it, adjusting temperature. All of these things really have the most influence on the finished wine. And so you have like a small window, I guess, about, my fermentations generally are about 3 weeks for primary alcoholic fermentation. So 21 days on skins. And during that time, we never, ever take our eye off the ball. Not for a moment. There's no days off. There's no holidays. There's no rest, effectively, until the fermentations are kind of complete and the wine has become, a stable element.
It's such an amazing process to see for those who've never been in a winery or production facility during this time. I really recommend those who have the opportunity to do so, just to see how it's living, like to see what's happening in a vat of the movement and hearing the sounds and the heat temperature change. It's wild. It's like this living art. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And to see the color of the juice and maybe taste it too, like it's beautiful.
Yeah, and that's the time I recommend anybody who's interested in wine go to visit a winery, because that's the time when all the action's taking place and the good stuff. And it is, there's a lot of art and intuition, you could say, during that process, but there's also a lot of science. I do something here called daily analysis, which I learned at several wineries that I worked with, where we literally sample everything every morning and put it through its a full analysis in the lab, and then I have basically all the numbers and all the sensories, and everything is there before you. And sometimes that process takes several hours in the morning to establish. But it's the most valuable thing we do, because we're basically never fixing things. We're always kind of managing and maintaining things during fermentation. So we see little changes, and we are able to kind of get in and intervene most of the time with temperature.
And the chemistry part is really something that I think people who are not in the process, you underestimate or just are not aware. The biological and the chemistry part. I mean, there's so many layers of what's going on for decisions. But then there are the things. So there are a lot of things that are within your control. You talked about protocols, decisions. There's the art. There's the science. There's the intuition. There's the chemistry. But the huge variable here is an out of our controls, and what we need to navigate and roll with is Mother Nature. So there have been a lot of huge and acute weather events and climate events in the world and in British Columbia. Yeah. So, putting, in addition to supply chain issues and skyrocketing costs from the last couple of years, consequential effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are so many challenges facing the global wine industry and our industry here in British Columbia. It's been really acute. There are fires. We could probably do a whole episode just on fires and on effects of smoke in winemaking and wine and tourism. But today, I think focusing on the deep freezes and cold temperatures. For those who aren't aware, earlier, beginning of 2023 and end of 2022, there were extremely cold snaps. And that's an understatement here in British Columbia in our wine regions. And it's had a devastating effect for the crop here and producers. Estimated more than 50% crop loss, I understand. And this is on the back of very short crops from recent years. So Grant, I know you've been involved in the forefront of a lot of awareness raising on these issues. Can you provide a bit of context for the listeners in terms of this loss, in terms of the scale and locations and the types of grapes, or whatever, from your point of view, from some of the main points that we need to be aware of this year?
Sure. Well, like you said, I mean, the timing of these cold events and heat events is critical, because you can have the same temperature when the vine is in a complete dormant state and nothing will happen. And the same with the summertime. People used to, when I first started tracking wine from the Okanagan around the world, of course, the first question they ask is, how can you even grow grapes in Canada? It's so cold there, and you people are living in igloos and et cetera. And my answer is that the vines survive because they're dormant in the winter when all that cold weather is coming. And in the last couple of years, that cold snap has come late November, early December, and it really has been 2 years now. And I know that because I've been bottling at those times, and so it's horrible to be bottling when you can't feel your fingers and your hands and whatnot because it's minus 20 something or other outside. But at the same time, you're thinking about the potential, devastating effect that it will have on your vines. And it is because they haven't completely gone into dormancy yet. If you're picking your grapes in October, they really do need a couple of months to kind of basically, send all the sap back down into the root system and really kind of just go into full dormancy. So So the last 2 years we've had been whacked pretty heavily with some minus, less plus or minus a few degrees beyond minus 27, minus 30, and the vines are weakened by that. A lot of our vineyards here are grafted, meaning that the vine material is placed on a rootstock that is resistant to nematodes and phylloxera, for example. And in this little graft, this union of graft is a really kind of sensitive part that often that's where the winter damage gets in. It causes the next wave of disease, which is called crown gall. And you're basically chasing your tail with all of these things because the vines, once the vine's weakened, it's very, very hard to kind of get it back on a happy state again. So it has been like that. It's been pretty rough the last couple of years. You talk about 50% crop loss. We're closer to 80 or 90 here in East Kelowna. And it's because we have some altitude. So for the very same reasons that we have a great site for Pinot Noir, we also have the danger of these events here, because Pinot Noir around the world is always grown in areas that are maybe the cooler site in a warmer area or the warmer site in a cooler area, but they're always on the edge. And because unfortunately that seems to be what makes great Pinot Noir. The vines need to struggle a little bit. Otherwise, they produce too much crop and it's dilute and less concentrated. So, we've planted these areas because the results when they come through in an average year are spectacular. In particular, here up at the saddle block, on our home block here, we won't have any saddle block for probably the next couple of years. But when we produce it, it's by far one of the top wines that we make. And the fruit quality is outrageous. So it has been tough, and it's exposed a lot of new planting areas. Obviously we've done really well here with Pinot Noir, and so everybody's tried to plant it wherever they can. And in every wine region, I've seen that. I've seen that in New Zealand, people trying to plant cow paddocks and pastures with Pinot Noir, and eventually it falls apart. And so, in a way, this has kind of identified for us, really where the winning sites are, the sites that can survive this. And there has been many of them. In particular, this year, I got a good, fortunately, almost all of my fruit comes from the Naramata Bench in Summerland. Both those areas have excellent lake influence, and they're lower in their altitude, and so they weren't affected by the winter kill as much. It's tough. It's reduced a lot of crop, but we're farmers. We're optimistic. We're resilient, and most importantly, we're adapters. So as things change and things evolve weather-wise, it's up to us to kind of either kind of walk away from sites that aren't working and develop into new areas that are.
So there's the decision making, and you might not know, but then there's the business, which is, there's all of the, costs of ripping up and then having to source. And is it hard to find vines now, or your clones that you want? And then waiting, and then having to wait, if people aren't aware, at least 3 years, often longer, 5, before you're producing grapes. That you can use to make the wine that you'd like to make, your special lot. So obviously this has hit the business bottom line. And there were discussions, about aid. So there has been some help for growers, not only grape growers, I understand, but orchardists this year with a crop renewal program. But could you share a little bit about the other types of assistance that winemakers have been discussing and looking for, and what some of the response has been so far, at least this year, from an aid perspective?
For sure. I mean, we have programs in place for crop insurance. They're not really programs that were designed in any way at any point to sort of deal with the widespread vine death and vine damage that we've seen here in the last 2 years. And so, the main thing that has been kind of asked of the federal government and the provincial government is to kind of try and expand those programs of replanting vines in the appropriate areas, of course, retraining trunks, and just having more money and more budget for assisting farmers in those sort of pursuits with, enlarging the crop insurance program. There was also a lot of discussion about allowing grapes in here from Eastern Washington, for example, which currently changes your winery status from a boutique artisan winery to effectively a commercial winery, puts you in a different tax situation. So there was some discussion, obviously, about maybe relaxing some of those laws to allow for some small producers to bring grapes in from Washington. There was talk about the amount of content in a wine, local content. I know Ontario, when they had years of struggling with crop sizes, that they relaxed the VQA laws there to allow them to have outside more percentage of outside wine from their region, etc., so that they could at least make wine and produce wine and stay economic. The new kind of method of sustainability is just staying in business, really, in this situation.
Yeah.
So anything that we can think of along those lines to kind of get us through. Nobody wants to dilute the wines here so that they're not pure BC and pure Okanagan grape grown wines, but maybe some. I know, for example, that if I was able to make a Syrah from Eastern Washington here and declared that it was 100% Eastern Washington grapes on the label and it wasn't BQ or anything, that my customers would be nothing more than happy to have something to buy rather than nothing.
I agree. Just from my observations of consumers and the questions I get asked, and my own personal view is I understand the origins of the rules now that affect the extent to which you can source grapes from outside of your region, your appellation, our province. I feel that we've come a long way, baby, however, in terms of consumer knowledge and consumer protection. And so if things are clearly labeled, and the consumer knows what is in that bottle, and that's a whole other discussion about labeling and ingredients, but knowledge, then, let the consumer decide, I feel. So, right? Like if you want to craft a Syrah from Washington State, the grapes from Washington State, and we can bring them in, and the consumer has diversity and variety of your craft and your art, why can't we offer that? And in terms of on a playing field that allows people to run their businesses and go and strive for sustainability. So that's my standing on my box. But, also kind of the, particularly in the global landscape right now, where in British Columbia, we're in a minority of having a minority of shortage of grapes. So south of our border, Washington State, I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, will have a glut of sorts because the Chateau Ste. Michelle, as I understand, they have released a lot of their growers. So there are going to be even more grapes available in the Washington market for purchase by winemakers. It seems crazy that there's so much just south of our border that could be used. But anyway, that's my personal view. But, I think, like you said, getting back to the point, I think consumers, we want to try everything. We're game. Just tell us what it is and the story and share your story and just be clear of where the ingredients come from. We do that with food items. So
totally. I mean,
right?
What's important, is in these moments that we're able to keep our tasting rooms open because they have, they supply a huge amount of other spin-off effects into the valley with tourism, wine touring. Everything kind of relies on people having some place to go to wineries and that. And, we have seen a few tasting rooms in a few places shut down because they don't have the quantity or the volume. And that's disappointing. We definitely, we just need a few things to bridge, I believe, the next kind of year or two. The funny thing about the wine industry is that there's always a delayed effect because things are in barrel. The bottles that we produce don't necessarily see the consumer for well over a year and sometimes longer, 18 months. And so the effects of this will be downstream, will be, next year and the year after. And we've already looked, pretty closely at what that looks like to a business when you don't have any production and you don't have anything to sell. It's tough for sure.
Absolutely. Well, understatement. And like you said, it's not only putting wine in bottles to get to the consumer in restaurants or in their homes or in bottle shops, but people who come to visit our wine regions and tasting rooms. And in British Columbia, so much economic activity is driven or can be driven through agritourism and agribusiness, which is winemaking, but also culinary adventure that we can offer. And there's so much potential there. And it is a big part of that. And sustainability of this whole industry and our economy, a big part of our economy here in this province.
Yeah, the outside effects of a wine world, when you go to the Willamette Valley, as you mentioned, or you come to the Okanagan, Marlborough and Blenheim, you can. It doesn't take much to see how much our industry, or the primary industry of wine, attracts other industries around it. In particular, like you mentioned, food and chefs and all of these great tourism pursuits. That people are creative and they open businesses based on the fact that they're going to see all those customers and clients coming to the region for wine. I know in Martinborough they actually. In New Zealand, they brought in a culinary school of new and young dynamic chefs into the region and stuff. So there's so many other things at stake than just a winery not having enough wine to sell.
Yeah, and also, last but certainly not least, the art and our connection to the world of the senses and with each other.
Yeah,
for me, this is a very basic part of life and a very enjoyable part of life. And we need to keep the grapes free and flowing.
Absolutely. And selfishly, this is kind of how I've not only made my living, but how I've expressed myself, for close to 30 years now. It was coming into this year and not having, grapes from various vineyards and it was kind of scary to be thinking, well, this is what I do, and I need material to achieve that. I need grapes.
I'd like to thank you so much for that art that you create. I'd like to thank you for your consumer awareness raising within the industry, and for providing such a great thing in life for us to enjoy and traveling through the glass. Thank you so much, Grant, for joining today. I'm wishing you the best for the rest of this season in what I know has been extremely challenging times. And I'm looking forward to my next visit to SpearHead when we can continue the chat and clink glasses. So thanks for joining
Hey, it's a pleasure. Very nice of you to invite me, and it's lovely to have this discussion with you, and look forward to seeing you when you get here next.
Thank you for joining me on my TT Wine Explorer podcast today. Stay tuned for the next episode. You can follow me on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Until then, remember to keep tasting, learning, and living.